hostess for the evening, and tonight we're going to talk about disability and incarceration, unless somebody comes on who wants to talk about something else. So I'm gonna fix up my little file here. It is the 31st of August already. I think it's an important issue because a lot of people in jail are disabled people in some way or another. So I think what I will start with, let me go to my screen sharing and let's see who's on. Oh, hi, Judge Judy Slayer. Welcome. Let's see who's with us. Okay. I'm going to go to my screen share and we'll go over to this. I feel like it's really important. First, I'm going to do, let's see, history of mental facilities. Yeah, of mental health facilities. Okay. And let me put the link here because I think that ties into the subject. So I want to do a little bit about where we used to be and how we got to where we are now. There used to be psychiatric hospitals. So there are still facilities, but they're all private. So this has made the expense of them very, very high. So pretty much there are a lot of people who do not have access to them. So let me go over here and we're going to explore some histories. History, not histories. Okay. So, psychiatric hospitals were once tied tightly to that of all American hospitals. So, like most physically sick men and women, most individuals remained with their families and received treatment in their homes. But some individuals seemed too violent or disruptive to remain at home or in their communities. So these places set aside separate wards for the mentally ill. Private hospitals depended on the money paid by wealthier families to care for their mentally ill husbands, wives, sons, and daughters to support their main charitable mission of caring for the physically sick poor. But the opening decades of the 19th century brought new European ideas about the care and treatment of the mentally ill. So they made asylums, and so it was built on the assumption that those suffering from mental illness could find their way to recovery and an eventual cure if treated kindly. It repudiated the use of harsh restraints and long periods of isolation that had been used to manage the most destructive behaviors of mentally ill individuals. It depended instead on specially constructed hospitals that provided quiet, secluded, and peaceful country settings, opportunities for meaningful work and recreation, a system of privileges and rewards for rational behaviors, and gentler kinds of restraints used for shorter periods. The Friends Asylum, established by Philadelphia's Quaker community in 1814, was the first institution specially built to implement the full program of moral treatment. Then, but they all chose quiet and secluded sites for these new hospitals, to which they would transfer their insane patients. So a lot of these were built. And Thomas Kirkbride, the influential medical superintendent of the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital, developed what quickly became known as the Kirkbride Plan for how hospitals devoted to moral treatment should be built and organized. This plan was the prototype for many future private and public insane asylums, called for no more than 250 patients living in a building with a central core and long rambling wings arranged to provide sunshine and fresh air, as well as privacy and comfort. So Dorothea Dix, a New England schoolteacher, became the most prominent voice and the most visible presence in a campaign to reform this care. She traveled throughout the country in the 1850s and 60s, testifying in state after state about the plight of their mentally ill citizens and the cures that a newly created state asylum built along the Kirkbride Plan and practicing moral treatment promised. By the 1870s, virtually all states had one or more of such asylums funded by state tax dollars. By the 1890s, however, all these institutions were under siege. Economic considerations played a substantial role. Local governments could avoid the costs of caring for the elderly residents in almshouses or public hospitals by redefining what was then termed senility as a psychiatric problem and sending them to state-supported asylums. So the numbers of patients in the asylums grew exponentially, well beyond the capacity and the willingness of states to provide the financial resources. But therapeutic considerations also played a role. The promise of moral treatment confronted the reality that many patients, particularly if they experienced some form of dementia, either could not or did not respond when placed in an asylum environment. So the asylums established nurses' training schools. In the 1860s and 70s, they rather than following an accepted European model with those who trained as nurses in psychiatric institution sat for a separate credentialing exam and carried a different title, they insisted that all nurses who trained in the psychiatric institutions sit for the same exam as those who trained in general hospitals and carry the same title of registered nurse. The American Nurses Association fought hard to prevent this, arguing that those who trained in asylums lacked the necessary medical, surgical, and obstetric experiences common to general hospital trained nurses, but they could not prevail politically. So finally, the nurses won and they got comparable clinical and classroom experience. It is at present hard to assess the impact of nurses' training schools on the actual care of patients in psychiatric institutions. In some larger public institutions, the students only worked on particular wards. It does seem they had a more substantive impact on the care of patients in much smaller and private psychiatric hospitals, where they had more contact with more patients. But it may be that their most enduring contribution was the opening of the practice of professional nursing to men. Training schools and asylums, unlike those in general hospitals, actively welcomed men. Male students found places either in schools that also accepted women or in separate schools formed just for them. But the economic crisis of the 1930s drastically cut state appropriations, and World War II created acute shortages of personnel. Psychiatrists themselves began looking for other practice opportunities by more closely identifying with general, more reductionistic medicine. Some established separate programs, often called psychopathic hospitals, within general hospitals to treat patients suffering from acute mental illnesses. Others turned to the early 20th century new mental hygiene movement and created outpatient clinics and new forms of private practice focused on actively preventing the disorders that might result in a psychiatric hospitalization. And still others experimented with new forms of therapies that posited brain pathology as a cause of mental illness, in the same way that medical doctors posited pathology in other bodily organs as the cause of physical symptoms. They tried insulin and electric shock therapies, psychosurgery, and different kinds of medications. By the 1950s, the death knell for psychiatric asylums had sounded. A new system of nursing homes would meet the needs of vulnerable elders. A new medication, chlorpromazine, offered hopes of curing the most persistent and severe psychiatric symptoms. And a new system of mental health care, the community mental health system, would return those suffering from mental illnesses to their families and their communities. Today, only a small number of the historic public and private psychiatric hospitals exist. Psychiatric care and treatment are now delivered through a web of services, including crisis services, short term and general hospital based acute psychiatric care units, and outpatient services ranging from 24-hour assisted living environments to clinics and clinicians' offices, offering a range of psychopharmacological and psychotherapeutic treatments. The quality and availability of these outpatient services vary widely, leading some historians and policy experts to wonder if asylums, in the true sense of the word, might still be needed for the most vulnerable individuals who need supportive living environments. Okay, so now we have a little bit about the history of psychiatric hospitals. So let's look at, when did mental health facilities close? So let's look at deinstitutionalization. Oh, where is it? Well, we didn't get a direct link. Let's see. Well, let's continue. All right, let's try this. And here's that. And the title, America's Long-Suffering Mental Health System. And I'll put this link in here. Alrighty. The recent school shooting in Parkland, Florida once again raised the question of the connection between mental illness, and mass violence. But if you suffer from a mental illness in the United States, you may find yourself thrown into a confusing and often contradictory system of doctors, clinics, institutions, home care, and drug regimens that is hardly a system at all. So, historian Zeb Larson traces how our response to the mentally ill has been shaped by a faith that such illness can be cured and a desire to deal with the mentally ill as cheaply as possible. In the wake of a mass shooting, commentators, pundits, and politicians all gather around to talk about the country's broken mental health system and suggest its connection to the violence. Their solutions, however, are few to none. Whether Nicholas Cruz's mental illness was a factor in the shooting is still being investigated. But the ease with which we talk about a defective mental health system is juxtaposed with a paucity of concrete solutions. So, lots of talk, no real solutions. This pattern raises the question of whether the American mental health care system is in fact broken. The metrics we have don't paint an encouraging picture. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reports that 1 in 5 Americans has experienced issues with mental health, and 1 in 10 youth have suffered a major bout of depression. The effects of mental illness on life quality and health outcomes are significant. Individuals with severe mental illness such as schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, or bipolar disorder, and bipolar is like 4% of the population, live on average 25 years less than other Americans. As many as a third of individuals with a serious diagnosis do not receive any consistent treatment. The mentally ill are far more likely to be the victims of violent crime rather than the perpetrators. Only 3 to 5% of violent crimes can be tied in some way to a person's mental illness, and people with mental illness are 10 times more likely to be the victims of violence than the general public. And while the relationship between mental illness and poverty is complicated, having a severe mental illness increases the likelihood of living in poverty. According to some estimates, a quarter of homeless Americans are seriously mentally ill. So, here's numbers and percentages of inmates with and without mental health problems in state prisons. So, any mental health problem is the blue here, 56%. no mental health problem is 43.8%. So you see the majority of people in prisons suffer from some mental health problem. Ooh, this poor man died in the shower with 180-degree water. Ugh. Most troubling, perhaps, is the criminalization of mental illness in the United States. At least a fifth of all prisoners have a mental illness of some kind, and between 25 and 40% of mentally ill people will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. A study by Human Rights Watch revealed that prison guards routinely abuse mentally ill prisoners. Darren Rainey, a mentally ill prisoner at the Dade Correctional Institution in Florida, was boiled to death in a shower after being locked in it for more than 2 hours by prison guards. That's just awful. More are sent to prison in part because fewer mental health facilities are available. The disappearance of psychiatric hospitals and asylums is part of the long-term trend towards deinstitutionalization, but jails and prisons have taken their place. Today, the largest mental health facilities in the United States are the Cook County Jail, the Los Angeles County Jail, and Rikers Island. So, how did we get to the point where mental illness is frequently untreated or criminalized? Activists, advocates, and professionals like to pin the blame on Ronald Reagan, particularly his 1981 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Bill, which raised defense spending while slashing domestic programs. One of the cuts was to federal funding for state community mental health centers. However, attributing the present state of the system solely to Reagan would ignore the prevailing patterns in mental health care that came before him. Three impulses have long shaped the American approach to mental health treatment. One is an optimistic belief in quick fixes for mental illness to obviate long-term care, ranging from psychotropic medications to eugenics. The second is a more pessimistic determination to make the system work as cheaply as possible, often by deferring the costs to somebody else and keeping them from public view. Last is the assumption that people with mental illness are undeserving of charity, either because of genetic defects or because they should be curable and thus not under long-term care. Indeed, mental health care occupies a paradoxical place in the history of social welfare in the United States, where aid is socially accepted only for the deserving needy. People with mental illnesses rarely fit this mold. At times, behaviors deemed socially aberrant were classified as mental illness. The American Psychiatric Association designated homosexuality a mental illness until 1973. The birth of the asylum and the hospital. The 19th century saw the growth of something like an organized asylum system in the United States. Asylums themselves were nothing new. London's Bethlehem Royal Psychiatric Hospital, better known as Bedlam, was founded in 1247. In the United States, however, the creation of these asylums took time, in part because their cost was deferred to state governments, which were leery of accepting the financial burden of these institutions. Consequently, local jails often housed ill individuals where no local alternative was available. And there's the Bedlam Hospital. Early in the 19th century, patients in asylums were called acute cases, whose symptoms had appeared suddenly and whom doctors hoped to be able to cure. Patients who were deemed chronic sufferers were cared for in their home communities. The so-called chronic patients encompassed a wide range of people, those suffering from the advanced stages of neurosyphilis, which is a venereal disease that attacks the brain, people with epilepsy, dementia, Alzheimer's, and even alcoholism. The number of elderly patients in need of assisted treatment increased in tandem with the increasing lifespans during the 19th century. As county institutions grew crowded, officials transferred as many patients as they could over to new state-run institutions in order to lower their own financial burdens. Wow. Oregon State Hospital for the Insane opened in 1883 and is one of the oldest continuously operated hospitals on the West Coast. And that's it right there. Oregon State Hospital was both the setting for the novel and the filming location of Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The patient population of Eastern Oregon State Hospital tripled in its first 15 years. That's the bottom picture. Oh, this is from 1913 to 1983. Wow. Built to relieve the overcrowding at Oregon State Hospital, Eastern Oregon State Hospital in Pendleton itself quickly became overpopulated. And this is a typical story of most mental institutions in the country. Most other states confronted similar circumstances. Some built a host of smaller institutions in different counties, while others concentrated their populations in a few large institutions. But the end result was the same. Hospitals proliferated and grew bigger. New York's inpatient population, which to be sure had outside proportions, was 33,124 in 1915. By 1930, it was 47,775. So, as the institutionalized population mushroomed, treatment of the mentally ill evolved. Doctors throughout the 19th century placed their hopes in what they called moral treatment, rehabilitation through exposure to normal habits. In many cases, these habits included working. Most institutions were attached Most institutions were attached to farms, partly to provide food for the people living there, but also to provide restorative work. Others had workshops. There is at best mixed evidence on whether such treatments were effective, although supporters claimed high rates of recovery for patients treated in asylums. In any event, moral treatment was only ever intended for acute cases, so it fell out of fashion under pressure from the ever multiplying population in hospitals. Patients performed manual tasks like shoemaking at the Willard Institution for the Insane in New York. Female patients engaged in agricultural labor at a mental health facility on the right. Combined with changing patient demographics, hospitals were increasingly serving as custodial institutions. Doctors working with patients suffering from dementia or late-stage neurosyphilis could not expect those in their care to improve. The role of medical professionals shifted from therapy to caretaking. And then prevention eugenics as a cure for mental illness. Discontented with the idea of being mere caretakers, psychiatrists began to work towards cures and preventative techniques in the late 19th and early 20th century. The most conspicuous manifestation was the growth of eugenics and forced sterilization. These cures targeted specific populations such as immigrants, people of color, the poor, unmarried mothers, and the disabled. Barbaric. Southern asylums in the Jim Crow era were segregated, and ones for African Americans received far less funding and accordingly suffered from chronic overcrowding and generally deplorable conditions. An investigative commission in 1909 found Montevu Asylum in Marion, Maryland, to be one of the state's worst facilities. Patients there slept on floors with minimal bedding, were often shackled, and had little space during the day. Although expressing some reservations about who was receiving eugenic treatment, many psychiatrists enthusiastically supported it. While doctors remained skeptical about the possibility of curing people with severe and persistent mental illness, preventing it through eugenics promised to solve the problem for future generations. In 1896, Connecticut became the first state to prohibit marriage for epileptics, imbeciles, and the feeble-minded. In 1907, it was also first to mandate the sterilization of an individual after a board of experts recommended it. 33 states ultimately adopted sterilization statutes, though certain states carried out a disproportionate number of these, with California alone accounting for a third of such operations. Ultimately, more than 65,000 mentally ill people were sterilized. A 1929 map of states that had sterilization legislation. Carrie Buck and her mother, Emma Buck, at the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded in 1924. Emma had been committed after accusations of immorality, prostitution, and having syphilis. Her daughter was committed after becoming pregnant at 17 when she was raped. While we now know that these sterilizations did not prevent mental illness, courts supported the programs. In Buck versus Bell, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. argued that sterilizations did not violate people's rights, concluding 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. After World War II, revelations about Nazi war crimes turned many citizens against such procedures, but the procedures persisted in some places well into the late 20th century, disproportionately affecting racial minorities. In Oregon, for example, the Board of Social Protection performed its last surgical sterilization in 1981 and disbanded 2 years later. A protest against forced sterilizations in North Carolina around 1971, and a historical marker in Raleigh, North Carolina, regarding the 7,600 people sterilized in that state from 1933 to 1973. From prevention to treatment. Beginning in the early 20th century, some doctors wanted to try new treatments for mental illness rather than preventative measures. They focused on the body instead of lifestyle or psyche. In trying to find physiological origins for maladies, psychiatrists hoped they might treat schizophrenia, manic depression, and other illnesses. Electroconvulsive therapy, which induces seizures in people through a series of electrical shocks, became one of the most famous such treatments and is still in limited use today. It remains controversial, not least because of its use on non consenting individuals and its side effects. And that's somebody being prepared for ECT in Liverpool, England in 1957. But clinical data indicates that it can be effective in mitigating or eliminating symptoms for long periods of time. The same cannot be said for other treatments for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder that emerged in the 1920s. Building off of the success of malaria therapy in curing syphilis, which involved deliberately exposing patients to malaria, the Austrian therapist, excuse me, my eye itches, Manfred Sackel introduced insulin shock therapy in 1927 as a cure for schizophrenia. He injected patients with successively larger doses of insulin, often to the point of inducing a coma, then revived them with glucose and repeated the procedure. The more fortunate patients emerged from this with considerable weight gain, the less lucky with permanent brain damage or a persistent comatose state. This is a nurse administering glucose to a patient receiving insulin shock therapy in Essex, England in 1943, and an image of removed teeth from Henry Cotton's The Defective Delinquent and Insane, 1921. Because the psychiatric profession was still relatively small and the bureaucracy around mental health care was primarily concentrated in hospitals, individual doctors could often experiment to see what would work. Henry Cotton, a doctor at New Jersey State Hospital from 1907 to 1930, for example, believed that mental illness was the product of untreated infections in the body. He removed patients' teeth, tonsils, spleens, and ovaries to try to ameliorate their symptoms. Mortality for these procedures was 30 to 45%. Perhaps the most extreme example of physical treatment was lobotomization. Developed by Antonio Egas Moniz, doctors severed connections between the prefrontal cortex, between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain by either drilling through the skull or inserting an implement past a person's eye. Around 40,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States. A few individuals recovered or showed improvement, but most showed cognitive and emotional declines, while others became incapable of caring for themselves or died. None of these treatments arrested the alarming growth of patient populations in state institutions. In the case of insulin therapy or Dr. Cotton's surgeries, we can see now there was no connection between the treatment and mental illness. Such treatments simply traumatized patients or inflicted lasting physical harm. Patients versus budgets. The Great Depression placed further strain on these institutions, and hospitals became dangerously overcrowded. States reduced appropriations for their major state hospitals, while counties began sending even more people to state institutions. Spending on patient care varied widely across the nation. In 1931, New York spent $392 per capita on hospital maintenance. Massachusetts 366, Oregon 201, and Mississippi only 172. Under these conditions, the quality of care deteriorated. For instance, Creedmoor Hospital in New York made headlines in 1943 following an outbreak of amoebic dysentery among patients. In Salem, Oregon, a patient accidentally put rat poison in the scrambled eggs in 1942, killing 47 people and sickening hundreds, a painful example of how sloppily the hospital was run. In 1948, the journalist Albert Deutsch released a book called The Shame of the States, in which he cataloged various abuses he witnessed in state hospital: overcrowding, beatings, and a near absence of rehabilitative therapy. That's his book. And this is one of the images in that book of the overcrowded day room in a Manhattan asylum. And the 1948 film The Snake Pit brought these conditions to life, showing the different levels of a hospital, including the snake pit, where patients deemed beyond recovery were abandoned in a padded cell. Such attention, along with World War II, mobilized public support for reforms to mental health care. The sheer number of potential soldiers rejected for service on psychiatric grounds, 1.75 million, shocked the public. Then the large number of psychological casualties among men, many of whom suffered what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, also suggested that environmental stress could contribute to psychological problems. So let's go to the next page. Deinstitutionalization, medicines to the rescue. The continual and many feared financially unsupportable growth of patient populations, the shameful conditions of the hospital, and the post-war interest in psychiatry created a groundswell for reform. The signing of the National Mental Health Act in 1946 and subsequent creation of the National Institute of Mental Health signaled that the federal government would play a larger role in overseeing mental health and soliciting the input of psychiatrists. By the mid-1950s, NIM studies were calling for community care rather than hospitalization. And this is a poster from 1944 from a health fair. The post-war period also saw the arrival of psychotropic medications and treatments. Thorazine became the first antipsychotic, making its way to the United States in 1954 and soon proving effective at alleviating certain symptoms. Effective medications raised the possibility of moving people out of the hospitals permanently. Generally, deinstitutionalization began around 1955 as the number of people in hospitals began to decline afterward. New York became one of the first states to reform its mental health care system, beginning with its Community Mental Health Act in 1954. This act provided funding to outpatient clinics for patients to visit for therapy or medications. Other states followed suit. So Thorazine reduced the need for electroshock therapy. And so these are advertisements from 1955 and 1956 for Thorazine. State governments proved unwilling to pay for extensive networks of clinics, however, and counties resisted the financial responsibility. California's Mental Health Act asked families of those in treatment to pay, thus minimizing the tax burden. Complaints about state hospital systems frequently circled back to its costs to the states, especially as patient rosters grew longer. At the same time, other reformers were optimistic about new in-hospital treatments such as milieu theory. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Milieu therapy? At its core, milieu therapy tried to divide patients into small communities that would make decisions about collective behavior and daily life in the hospital wards. It aimed to create collaborative patient-staff relationships and teach people how to live independently. Expanded role for the government. The Kennedy administration and the Great Society helped to break the financial logjam at the state level and give politicians the monetary support to shutter their hospitals. In 1963, the president called for a new approach that would allow mentally ill individuals to live successfully in their communities. There's the Kennedy family at Hyannisport, Massachusetts in 1931, with Rosemary Kennedy on the far right. President John F. Kennedy signing the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Center Construction Act in late October 1963. Kennedy proposed a program to assist in the inauguration of a wholly new emphasis and approach to care for the mentally ill, he said in a speech. This approach relies primarily upon the new knowledge and new drugs acquired and developed in recent years, which make it possible for most of the mentally ill to be successfully and quickly treated in their own communities and return to a useful place in society. Kennedy's sister Rosemary, over here, had been born with a mild intellectual disability and in her teenage years reportedly became difficult to manage. Fearing that Rosemary's behavior might embarrass the family, Joseph Kennedy Sr. had her lobotomized, hoping to improve her system. Instead, it left her an invalid hidden away in an institution. Her father reportedly never visited her again. Kennedy's bill offered $150 million in grants for states to construct community mental health centers, with the federal government sharing between 1 and 2/3 of the total cost. The centers would be required to offer inpatient services, outpatient services, partial hospitalization, 24-hour emergency services, and educational work. The bill called for 2,000 of them to be built by 1980, with the goal of rendering most state hospitals obsolete. Signing the Community Mental Health Act was one of Kennedy's last acts. He was assassinated a few days later. So here's a graph showing the decrease in inpatients from 1950 to 1995. So we have a peak here in 1955 when they came out with the first antipsychotic drugs. Then in 1965 we got Medicare and Medicaid, and so we see a decline there. The Community Mental Health Act was the brainchild of just a few psychiatrists, Robert Felix, Stanley Yallis, and Bertram Brown. They categorically opposed any significant role for state hospitals in the future, and largely bypassed the directors of state mental health programs. Felix hoped that the community health centers would have a preventative effect on mental illness. Certainly, Kennedy seemed optimistic about the prospects of medications, which he said could successfully and quickly treat people to return them to a useful place in society. Felix's belief that the CMHCs would prevent mental illness was unfounded. there is little evidence that they had any positive effect. Underfunded from the beginning, by 1980 only 754 of the promised centers were in operation. But the CMHC program did have the effect of undermining the role of hospitals in mental health care. The states, in turn, had an ambivalent relationship with the CMHCs, in part because the funding structure demanded that states pay increasingly more for the centers. Because of that, many CMHCs sent patients requiring significant care back to the hospitals. Absent a suitable number of centers, states fell back on developing aftercare and clinics, which were spotty at best. Originally known as the Great Asylum for the Insane, Agnew State Hospital in Santa Clara, California, opened in 1885 and closed in 1998. Built after World War II, um, that's on the left. Built after World War II, the Demented Men's Building at Agnew State Hospital on the right was an attempt to move towards preparing patients to leave the hospital. Other federal programs had the effect of further emptying state institutions. Medicare provided funds for the elderly to be treated in nursing homes rather than hospitals. In 1972, Social Security was modified so that payments could be made to individuals not living in a hospital to encourage people to live independently. Medicaid was also designed to encourage states to move people out of hospitals and into smaller facilities. States could only be reimbursed for expenses if individuals were living in a facility with 16 or fewer beds. States get out of the mental health business of mental health, or try to. Under the new federal strictures, states had incentives to close their asylums. California, under Governor Ronald Reagan, became a leader in deinstitutionalization and set an example for other states. Yet California's deinstitutionalization also reveals the dual impulses that drove politicians. Nick Petras, a state legislator, worked to limit the number of involuntary commitments by passing laws that restricted how people could be sent to a hospital. Once those hospitals were closed, Petras hoped the funds would follow the patients. Instead, in the landmark Lanterman-Petras Short Act that Petras authored, Governor Reagan diverted the funds that were supposed to pay for patient care at the county level into the state's general fund. Good grief. So this is a graph depicting inpatient psychiatric beds by type from 1970 to 2002. So you've got more residential treatment, and state and county hospitals go from there down to there. Even states that historically been sympathetic to funding mental health care followed the pattern. New York counties resisted opening centers because of the funding formula the state had instituted. In Massachusetts in the mid-1970s, under Michael Dukakis, hospital closures accelerated partly out of the need to slash budget expenditures. Once budgets were slashed, many hospitals saw their quality of care decline further, leading to more demands that they be emptied and closed. Decisions in both the state and federal courts also changed how commitment worked, further shrinking state hospitals. The culminating Supreme Court decision, O'Connor versus Donaldson in 1975, held that people not deemed to be a threat to themselves could not be hospitalized against their will. After the 1975 decision, hospitals became, as they remain today, forensic institutions for the most part, housing criminal offenders or individuals awaiting trial. As a result, from 1970 to 2010, the number of inpatient psychiatric beds in the United States declined from 413,000 to 37,679. Deinstitutionalization, what happened to the people? This is the interesting part. Many individuals' quality of life improved after leaving the hospitals, a process that accelerated from the 1950s. Medications significantly enhanced their ability to manage their symptoms. Once people exited hospitals, their destinations varied. Reformers hoped that they would go home to families, but in many cases, people had no family connections. Without family to support them, and often having never lived independently, people with mental illness often turn to the federal government for support. And here's a book by Kenneth Donaldson called Insanity Inside Out. Confined to Florida State Hospital against his will for 15 years, Kenneth Donaldson filed the lawsuit that eventually became the Supreme Court decision O'Connor versus Donaldson, and wrote a book about his experiences. Okay, the number of halfway homes exploded. Often these group homes were opened by ex-hospital staff. They tended to cluster in low-rent areas of major cities, partly because that was where the operators could afford to run them, and because neighborhood associations were generally unwilling to accept group homes in safer, more affluent neighborhoods. The quality of these homes could vary dramatically. Most states paid the operators of such homes by the head, which gave them incentives to maximize profits. Horror stories became distressingly common from the 1970s onward. A house fire in Worcester, Massachusetts killed 7 people in a group home, while 9 people in Mississippi were found living in a 10 by 10-foot shed with no running water and only 2 mattresses. The worst of these houses came to resemble the hospital wards people had left, with drab environments and limited contact outside the house. This is a 1966 advertisement in the Journal of the American Medical Association for the antipsychotic drug Thorazine. The promise of medications to cure mental illness has also faltered. Medications have proven variable in their efficacy from person to person. They might be useful in controlling one set of symptoms while failing to address another. They also frequently involve a number of side effects, the most widely known of which is the Thorazine shuffle, a combination of the tranquilizing effect of drugs with restless legs, making consumers walk with a shuffling gait. But others include severe weight gain, facial tics, and muscle spasms. Medications must be taken consistently to remain effective. This helped to reinforce the so-called revolving door of mental health, in which a person discontinues a medication, decompensates psychiatrically, is arrested or hospitalized, recovers, and repeats. 1962 advertisement for Thorazine. Policymakers never considered these complications of drug-based solutions. Doctors were often circumspect about the effectiveness of medications, but professional medical input into federal government programs was limited. The era of deinstitutionalization reached its denouement with Reagan's 1981 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. It repealed federal funding for community mental health centers, transformed other federal aid to the states into block grants, cut the dollar outlays by as much as 30%, and left the states with broad discretion over how to spend the money. By the mid 1990s, hospitals had mostly shrunk to their present size. So now we come to mental health today. It would be a mistake to paint deinstitutionalization as a through and through failure. The hospitals that existed in the 1940s were often abusive, and many people today can live their lives in a way they might only have dreamt of a century ago. Hospitalization was not the best option for people with mild symptoms that could be managed through medications. Yet many people were left behind as well, either on the street or in jails and prisons. What is striking about the legacy of deinstitutionalization is how much of it was motivated by financial opportunism on the part of the states. Over the course of the 20th century, states' elderly patients could have their treatment funded by Medicaid. Hospitals could be shrunk and staff ratios could be improved without having to actually spend more money. Clinics would be cheaper to run than hospitals, and medications would maybe even obviate the need for any treatment at all. This focus on reducing funding outlays helps to explain the limitations of this brand of reform. It was supposed to be cost effective. Those individuals who required more support once they left the hospitals found themselves abandoned. Opened in 1837, Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia, became the largest insane asylum in the world, oh my, with over 13,000 patients, and by the 1950s had a staff to patient ratio of 1 to 100. It stopped accepting new patients in 2010, and 4 of the asylum's buildings have been converted into prisons. The creation of a large indigent class of people with mental illness was not inevitable from a policy perspective. Studies from the United States, Germany, and Switzerland, among other countries, have confirmed that even people who have been institutionalized most of their lives and who have experienced severe mental illness for years on end can live independently if they have certain supports available: housing, aftercare, support networks, and jobs. However, in the United States, those supports frequently have not existed, or in certain cases have been eroded or ended once people return to the community. Psychiatrists such as Robert Felix underestimated the extent to which they would be necessary, and politicians at the state and federal level were unwilling to spend the money. As the mental health system again reemerges in public and policy discussions in the wake of another mass shooting, the question remains: is there a link between closing the hospitals and mass shootings? In all likelihood, no. Americans do not suffer from higher rates of mental illness than other people in the world. While all do not agree, the general consensus among psychiatrists is that there is no meaningful link between mental illness and the number of mass shootings. Representing this more majority scientific view, epidemiologist Matthew Miller argues that the number of mass shootings in the United States has far more to do with the availability of guns. In contrast, some psychiatrists, as E. Fuller Torrey, maintain that there are certain links between untreated mental illness and violence, although Torrey's conclusions are controversial and are challenged by other experts. And here's students from a Brooklyn, New York high school demanding that elected officials enact gun legislation as part of a broader national student walkout on the 1 month anniversary of the Parkland, Florida shooting. President Trump recently suggested that the United States needs more hospitals and asylums to prevent future shootings, but that didn't go anywhere. Current commitment laws would make it difficult to hold people against their will en masse. To respond in this manner would simply reframe mental illness as a problem of violence, not of mistreatment and maltreatment of Americans with mental illness. Such a program would be unlikely to fix a broken system. As for the state of Florida, legislators are trying to pass additional appropriations for mental health care. The long history of American approaches to mental illness should leave us doubtful that the funding would remain for long. So, and there's lots of further reading and stuff. So, what do y'all think? I think that we definitely need more mental health care in this country, and I think it should be community based. So let's go over to the incarceration side and look up something about mental health prisons. Mental health treatment in prison. Okay, let's see how old this is. I want to get something more recent. Let's see. "2015." So this see, let's find something a little more friendly. Okay. All right, that's from, let's see, APA. This is good. All right, let's look at improving mental health for inmates. From the American Psychological Association. This is from 2019, so that's pretty okay. These are taking a while to get through, but it's good stuff. Okay, let's see what the American Psychological Association has to say about this. Jamichael Mitchell, 24, had not been taking his schizophrenia medication when he was arrested for stealing a bottle of Mountain Dew, a Snickers bar, and a zebra cake from a 7-Eleven. After waiting more than a month in jail, he was found to be incompetent to stand trial due to mental illness and ordered to go to a state hospital for competency restoration, a combination of psychiatric medication, mental health treatment, and education about the legal process. But no beds were available, and Mitchell's condition deteriorated as weeks turned into months while he waited in jail. He refused to eat and take medication. 4 months after his arrest, Mitchell was found dead in a cell covered in urine and feces. He had died of cardiac arrhythmia related to wasting syndrome, a disorder characterized by extreme weight loss. Cases like this are so tragic because they are preventable, say psychologists who advocate for more effective mental health services in correctional facilities. The unfortunate truth is that despite improvements over the past 30 years, the correctional system continues to struggle to meet the vast needs of the increasing number of inmates with mental health conditions, says Thomas Fagan, PhD, professor emeritus at Nova Southeastern University in Florida and a former administrator for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. About 37% of people in prison have a history of mental health problems, according to a 2017 report from the U.S. Department of Justice. More than 24% have been previously diagnosed with major depressive disorder, 17% with bipolar disorder, 13% with a personality disorder, and 12% with post-traumatic stress disorder. The numbers are even higher for people in jail, where one-third have been previously diagnosed with major depressive disorder and almost one-quarter with bipolar disorder. We lock up people with mental health problems when we should really be treating these people in the community, says Fagan. In the absence of that, prisons and jails become de facto treatment centers. As a result, psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers have become essential mental health providers in correctional settings, and they can be a driving force for new programs in state and federal facilities, he says. Here is a look at some of the latest evidence-based approaches from psychologists. New thinking patterns. Several psychologists are focused on keeping people with mental health problems out of correctional facilities. Among them is Robert Morgan, PhD, a psychology professor at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, who is testing excuse me, a new prison-based program that helps inmates learn to avoid behaviors that may lead to reincarceration after they are released. Morgan's program, Changing Lives and Changing Outcomes, seeks to address antisocial thinking and behavior patterns, which he calls criminalness, among inmates who have been diagnosed with mental illnesses. The program is novel because it diverges from the traditional belief that providing better mental health care alone will reduce the chances of criminal behavior patterns. Morgan contends that it's critical to combine mental health care and treatment for criminalness because inmates can learn not only how to cope with mental illness, but also practical life skills such as how to challenge antisocial thought patterns and to develop healthy connections with others. I like that. We learned through a series of studies that people with mental illness in the justice system are there in part because they present with criminal risk in similar ways to those who are not mentally ill. They interpret interpersonal situations differently than non-criminals, says Morgan. For evidence, this population is more likely to see someone bumping into them as asserting dominance rather than as an accident, Morgan explains. Morgan's ideas were born out of years of clinical work in prisons where he witnessed the struggles people faced, especially those with mental illness. In federal and state prisons at both minimum and supermaximum levels of security, he saw that people with mental illness were at increased risk of victimization, psychiatric rehospitalization, and criminal recidivism. They also had trouble in adjusting to the institutional environment, and often their psychiatric symptoms worsened. On the basis of that experience, Morgan wanted to help incarcerated people with mental illness stay out of prison once released. Nearly 80% of all released prisoners are arrested again within 6 years, according to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. In a pilot study, he tested his model of addressing both psychiatric and criminogenic needs with 47 male inmates who were in prison or a residential facility. The 6-month program included 155 hours of group and individual therapy sessions, in which clinicians taught participants about healthy ways of dealing with anger and fear, how to interpret situations, medication adherence, and other skills. He found that participants experienced decreased depression, anxiety, hostility, paranoid ideation, psychoticism, and reactive criminal thinking. Cool. Morgan's team then tried the program with a larger sample of 169 participants in residential facilities. This time, they wanted to determine how much of the program content the inmates retained. This is important for improving community outcomes, says Morgan. Simply reducing distress during the course of treatment is a positive step, but that can be very temporary. We wanted to assess if participants were able to learn and retain the information to be applied in their everyday lives. The team found that most participants increased and retained their knowledge, but those who had lower scores on the quizzes after each module were more likely to drop out of the program. In these cases, clinicians may need to provide more sessions to reduce the risk of dropout. The next step, Morgan says, will be to investigate whether the program reduces recidid, recidivism, recidid, recidivism rates. The program has also been adapted for mentally ill inmates in solitary confinement who can't participate in group sessions. Participants receive written material and worksheets, and clinicians provide brief feedback during mental health rounds. The goal is to help them learn how to manage their mental illnesses and identify issues that put them at risk of continued segregation, says Morgan, who is evaluating the program. Influencing correctional policies. University of California, Santa Cruz psychologist Craig Haney, PhD, is exploring ways to reduce the number of people placed in isolation. Through interviews with hundreds of inmates in isolation, many of whom have mental illnesses, Haney has shown that people living in solitary confinement, defined as the absence of meaningful social contact and interaction with others, frequently experience depression, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and anger. Studies have also shown that stress related reactions are common, including decreased appetite, heart palpitations, and a sense of impending emotional breakdown, as well as sleeplessness, heightened levels of anxiety, and paranoia. Over time, isolated inmates can also lose the ability to feel comfortable around people. That's terrible. longing for the presence of other people and feeling that absence is painful. So these inmates adjust by learning to cope in a world without other human beings, says Haney. Once they are released, the presence of other people can create anxiety. So paradoxically, many self isolate. Through his work as an expert witness in numerous court cases, Haney has advocated for reforms that would lead to more humane conditions, including increased mental health care and decreased use of solitary confinement. In 2017, his testimony in a federal case against the Alabama Department of Corrections helped to influence the court's decision to order the state to improve practices and conditions in its in prisons. In Georgia, Haney was invited to inspect a prison where he discovered that inmates in solitary confinement were only allowed outside their cells for 5 hours a week, and some were in darkened cells for months. His report documenting the condition helped inmates win a settlement in January that allows prisoners to spend 4 hours outside their cells each day and to eventually have access to educational classes. Haney recently turned his attention overseas to find innovative correctional models that could inspire prison reform in the United States. Through the U.S. Norway Correctional Culture Exchange Program, sponsored by the Criminal Justice and Health Consortium at the University of California, San Francisco, Haney regularly travels with a contingent of U.S. correctional officials to Norwegian prisons, where the prisoners' routines mimic normal daily life as much as possible. Inmates have more freedom of movement, can access rehabilitation programs, and rarely experience solitary. They also place a tremendous amount of emphasis on the interactions between correctional officers and prisoners, notes Haney. The officers are more like social workers who get to know inmates rather than enforcing punishments. If a prisoner acts out, officers try to understand what led to the outburst and to address the problem or concern rather than punish the individual. The results of this positive prison culture in Norway are clear: low turnover among staff and decreased recidivism because inmates are better prepared to reintegrate into society. Visiting prison officials from Alaska, Idaho, North Dakota, Oregon, and Rhode Island were so impressed that they have started adopting the Norwegian philosophy in their own prisons by increasing the rehabilitation programming and training their staffs to relate differently to inmates, says Haney. Let me take a look and see who's trying to get a hold of me. Um, okay. Okay. Alrighty. Um, Introducing trauma-informed care. Like Haney, Dave Stevens, PsyD, Doctorate of Psychology, believes that interactions between correctional staff and inmates significantly influence the mental health of prisoners, and he's improving conditions for inmates by teaching correctional employees about the brain's response to trauma. Through the National Institute of Corrections Training Center in Colorado, Stevens has trained more than 100 jail and prison wardens, mental health professionals, caseworkers, and nurses on how to communicate in inmates in ways that minimize the chance of re traumatizing individuals who have a history of trauma. He helps staff understand that many inmates, especially those with mental illness, have histories of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse that lead to distrust and a sense of worthlessness. Stevens explains how to halt this cycle by being respectful to inmates and by teaching them what to expect when they encounter new situations. Correctional officers who conduct pat-down searches, for example, can explain beforehand what they will be doing to the inmate. This can reduce anxiety and the risk of re traumatizing people who are expecting violation and abusive behavior, Stevens says. He also encourages facilities to provide inmates information at the time of booking about what they might experience psychologically once they're incarcerated, and steps to take if they're having symptoms of anxiety, depression, or other types of mental illness. Stevens sometimes encounters resistance from staff who believe it is not their job to make things easy for inmates, he says. But with some explanation and discussion, staff become more open and positive, especially because these strategies create a safer environment for both inmates and employees. Alternatives to hospitalization. Forensic psychologist W. Neil Gowan-Smith, Ph.D., is taking another tack to improve care for mentally ill offenders: community-based treatment. Rather than relying on overcrowded state hospitals to provide competency restoration services for people with mental health problems who have been accused of misdemeanor offenses or nonviolent felonies, Gowan Smith has been advocating for outpatient competency restoration. Through such programs, offenders receive these services from private contractors, outpatient treatment centers, or community mental health systems. To study the feasibility of using these programs in lieu of inpatient programs, Gowan Smith, an assistant clinical professor of psychology at the University of Denver, collected data from 16 states that were using outpatient methods of restoring competency. He found that 70% of the participants in the outpatient programs achieved competency restoration, compared with roughly 80% in state hospitals. The duration of treatment was also comparable between the two settings. This early research shows that outpatient community restoration programs produce similar outcomes to inpatient programs at a fraction of the cost and without compromising public safety. In the study, Gowan Smith also found that allowing people to have competency restored in the community did not pose a risk to the public as measured by the number of negative incidents, such as rearrest or violence, which were very low. Outpatient programs can also allow individuals to keep their housing and stay more connected to community support systems, he says. Identifying suicide patterns. Psychologists are also working with correctional systems to better identify inmates who may be at risk of suicide. Suicides accounted for 7% of state prison deaths in 2014. Reducing these numbers has become a high priority, says Sharon Barboza, PhD, Vice President of Mental Health at MHM Centurion, a company that provides healthcare services to state correctional systems and large county jails. To better understand who is at risk of suicide, Barboza and her colleagues conducted a study of 925 state prison and jail inmates, comparing those who had attempted with those who had completed suicide. The researchers found that those who had died by suicide tended to be male, older, more educated, married, or separated or divorced at the pretrial stage, committed for a violent crime, not on suicide precautions, and not previously on close observation. Although Barboza was not surprised by those characteristics, she was concerned that those who had died by suicide had not previously been identified as at risk. Inmates may not be inclined to share with staff that they are at risk of suicide because we respond by putting them alone in cells for close monitoring, which can be very isolating, Barbosa says. In an effort to change that, she's working with the National Commission on Correctional Health Care and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention on a national initiative to improve assessment, training, and interventions for inmates who may be at higher risk. The two organizations are partnering as part of an effort to reduce the nation's annual suicide rate for all people by 20% by 2025. So far, Barbosa has participated in 3 suicide prevention summits, where she leads the assessment group that is working to develop better suicide risk screening tools. We are seeing more completed suicides in both corrections and the general population nationally, and that is alarming, says Barbosa. For her, each suicide is a reminder that finding ways to provide better mental health care to more than 2 million incarcerated people in the United States has the potential to improve and sometimes save thousands of lives each year. So, there we go. So, that's what's happening in incarceration and mental health. Um, and here's a fact sheet, not very friendly as far as, okay, I will put this here anyway, but it's, not particularly user friendly for everybody, but I will put it anyway because, I want something that is a little friendlier for my audience. Let's see. Well, that wasn't where I wanted that to go. Okay. I'll put that in the chat anyway. And thank you for the person who sent the feral cat picture, but I can't download it on my phone because my phone is out of room. So you could just send me a text message and let me know what it is. I'm about to lose my MMS capabilities, so that's dependent on my phone service, and I do have the free phone service because I can't afford the regular. So, if you would, when you text me, just text words instead of pictures, and I'll be grateful. You can email pictures to my email, danis@danisstories.com. So I should put that there for links or pictures, things like that. So, let's look at how many mentally ill are in prison or arrested. Okay. In 2014, there were 744,600 inmates in county and city jails in the United States. If 20% of these had a serious mental illness, jail inmates with severe psychiatric disease in U.S. jails numbered approximately 149,000 that year, and the number has grown. So, let's look here. Here's a shocking fact. Mentally ill inmates remain in jail longer than other inmates. So let me put this link out there so we can see kind of what's going on. And we won't know for a while about this year's statistics. This is from 2016, and I know it's worse after the pandemic, so keep that in mind as we look through this. Serious mental illness has become so prevalent in the U.S. correction system that jails and prisons are now commonly called the new asylums. That's pretty depressing. Um, Los Angeles County Jail, Chicago's Cook County Jail, or New York Rikers Island Jail each hold more mentally ill inmates than any remaining psychiatric hospital in the United States. Overall, approximately 20% of inmates in jails and 15% of inmates in state prisons are now estimated to have a serious mental illness. Based on the total inmate population, this means approximately 383,000 individuals with severe psychiatric disease were behind bars in the United States in 2014, or nearly 10 times the number of patients remaining in the nation's state hospitals. That's awful. In 44 states, a jail or prison holds more mentally ill individuals than the largest remaining state psychiatric hospital. In every county in the United States, with both a county jail and a county psychiatric facility, more seriously mentally ill individuals are incarcerated than hospitalized. A 2004 to 2005 survey found there were more than 3 times more seriously mentally ill persons in jails and prisons than in hospitals. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this just underscores the situation of how bad it is that we are putting out $5 billion to support our prison populations. We have more people incarcerated in the United States than in any country in the world, including communist China. Let me find something to back that up. Yeah. Comparing English-speaking developed countries, the overall incarceration rate in the U.S. is 639 per 100,000 of all ages as of 2018. In Canada, it's 104. In England and Wales, it's 130, and Australia, 160. And the Washington Post says yes, the U.S. locks people up at a higher rate than any other country. And I will give you a link to this. So we are already spending our tax dollars to put these people in jail where they don't get as much mental health care as they would out in the community. So it begs the question, why don't we have mental health centers in our communities to prevent people from getting locked up by using these techniques that we've just been reading about? And here's the article. The U.S. has less than 5% of the world's population, yet we have almost 25% of the world's total prison population. They are much higher than they were 30 or 40 years ago, despite the fact that crime is at historic lows. And this was as of 2015. This was a speech by Hillary Clinton. Uh, and Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky also was talking about it. Not only does the current overpopulated, underfunded system hurt those incarcerated, it also digs deeper into the pockets of tax-paying Americans. This is a seemingly unbelievable figure that turned out to be correct. The widely cited statistic about the United States' share of prisoners compared to other countries recently earned the rare Geppetto check mark by the fact checker. So, more than half the 222 countries and territories in the world prison population list by the UK-based International Centre for Prison Studies had rates below 150 per 100,000. So, yeah, we don't rate very well. Median European prison population rate was 133.5 inmates per 100,000 people, but in the US it was 478, 3.5 times the European rate. The US far exceeds Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. So, the article has a lot of good stuff. General victimization rates in the US rank about the same as countries in Western Europe, but the US incarceration rate was still much higher. And we rank on the low end among Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries in social service expenditures as a percentage of the gross the GDP, but in 2002 through 2007, but the incarceration was the highest among similarly ranked countries, which suggests that if we put more money into social programs, we might not have as many people sitting in jail. The United States has higher homicide rates than other economically developed countries and is also an outlier for armed robbery. On the public punitive attitude scale, which measures public demand for punishment, the United States ranked the highest out of nearly 30 countries. We're a very unforgiving lot, aren't we? Crime spiked in the 1960s and through the 1970s. This was not unique to the United States, but the United States got very tough on crime. A series of get tough policies were enacted in the 80s and into the 90s. What sets the American pattern so clearly apart from the rest of developed nations is a byproduct of the generation after 1972. The Get Tough policies became politically popular, but the network of social service programs is less developed in the United States than in comparable countries. The U.S. relies more on jails and prisons for people who otherwise would have been diverted to non institutionalized care. People with mental health or substance abuse issues, the homeless, the youth. So there's not a national network that can support a systemic move away from incarceration. So there's a lot of fees that are unique to the United States contribute to reincarceration. So the United States incarcerates people at a higher rate than other countries, even when adjusting for other factors. And the crime rate has been decreasing steadily in recent years. Now, we've had an uptick in violence recently, so that's not going to show up in this. But, the fact is that we incarcerate more people than communist China, which is disturbing. So we really need programs to help people avoid incarceration, and we need drug treatment programs. We need all sorts of things that the billions of dollars we pour into prisons would pay for. So we need to quit being so unforgiving of people who commit crimes. We need to get less tough on crime when it's a person that has a mental health problem or a disability that may make them seem more violent. So that's how I'm going to wrap it up. People who are mentally ill don't belong in jail. They belong to in a program that will help them to learn better ways of living. And these studies that we cited here prove that it does work. We just need more of them. mental health is not an easy problem, but the fact that we are just simply throwing people in jail, that's not working either, because 80% of them end up going right back to jail within 6 years. So that is a symptom that we are not doing the right thing. So we need to quit thinking of people in jail as all murderers and rapists and all that. It's not true. But we may be even creating more of them by throwing people in prison who are exposed to that kind of ideology. So we really need to be treating mental illness, and we need to be treating drug addiction. And community centers to do that would be the way to approach it. So I encourage all of you to vote for things that you see come up in the legislature to shift the emphasis away from throwing people in jail, and let's soften some of these harsh sentences that um, these laws that we enacted earlier in the war on crime, because they did not work. We need to humanize our prisons and quit thinking that, oh, prisoners shouldn't get anything because they're in there being punished for the bad things they did. When you've got so many people with mental health problems, no wonder we have a lot of people in jail that maybe do not belong there. So I'm urging y'all to think about this and not to be so quick to be, oh yeah, they need to go to jail. They need to, maybe they don't need to go to jail. Maybe we need to have more social workers on the staffs of police departments. Maybe we need to provide more education in mental health issues and disability issues to those who protect us. I don't think it's necessarily that police are bad. It is that they just aren't trained in mental health issues, and they need help in that respect to provide those mental health services on a crisis basis. So I think we need to divert some of the funding to police departments to provide on call crisis mental health service to those who need it, and see if we can get the incarceration down. Because we really only need to reserve prisons for people who belong there, you know? That's my take on it, and that's my handicapped moment for the night, that we need to be more active in talking to our congressmen and finding out, just do an internet search on what laws are in your legislature right now, and let your congressman know how you feel about those bills. And, you know, we need to look for people who are talking about this and maybe swing some votes their way. Because we really need a kinder, gentler country. We need to be kinder and gentler towards each other, and we need to be kinder and gentler towards people in jail, because not everybody is there because they committed some heinous crime. A lot of people are there simply because there weren't enough mental health beds for them to go to one. So, y'all take care, and we'll talk about something else important next time. And please feel free to send me messages and let me know what y'all want to talk about. And thank you for joining me tonight. And let me look. Oh, Fast Deb, welcome. Glad to have you, and thank you for sticking it out with me this long. Until tomorrow night, this is Granny Handicap, and I'm blue because of the screensaver on my TV. I just noticed that. It's like, what? Oh well. Anyway, this is Granny Handicap saying, I hope you have a pleasant week and don't let the disabilities get you down. Try to ignore your can't do list and concentrate on what you can do and enjoy what you can do. Y'all take care. Good night. I'll go to my goodbye scene. Y'all take care. Bye bye now.